The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Highgrove House as Charles lay in his bed, surrounded by the familiar scent of lavender from the gardens he had tended for decades. His breathing had become labored over the past few weeks, and today felt different. There was a weight in the air that even the staff could sense as they moved quietly through the corridors. Dr. Matthews had visited the previous evening, speaking in hushed tones with Camilla outside the bedroom door. Charles had pretended to sleep, but he caught fragments of their conversation. Words like weeks and comfortable drifted through the slightly open door. He understood what they meant without needing the details spelled out. Camilla entered the room carrying a breakfast tray, her movements careful and measured. She had been doing this routine for months now, bringing him tea and toast that he could barely manage to eat. Her face showed the strain of caring for him, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of efficiency. "The newspapers are full of speculation again," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "They're camped outside the gates like vultures." Charles managed a weak smile. "Let them wait. They've been doing it for 70 years. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had been complex from the beginning. Their love story had weathered storms that would have destroyed most couples. From their early affair during his marriage to Diana, through years of public scrutiny and hatred, to finally finding acceptance and marriage in their later years. Now, as his health failed, their dynamic had shifted once again. Camilla had become his caregiver, managing his medications, coordinating with doctors, and shielding him from the constant media attention. But Charles could see something changing in her eyes. The woman who had once looked at him with such passion and devotion now seemed distant, as if she was already preparing for life after him. William arrived that afternoon with Catherine and the children. The grandchildren brought energy into the somber house, their laughter echoing through rooms that had grown too quiet. Charles watched from his bed as his eldest son took charge, making phone calls and arrangements with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "The Prime Minister wants to speak with you," William said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I told him you're resting, but he's quite insistent." Charles waved his hand dismissively. "Constitutional duties can wait another day. I want to spend time with George and Charlotte while I still can." The afternoon passed slowly. Charles found himself drifting between sleep and wakefulness, sometimes confused about where he was or what year it was. In lucid moments, he would study the faces around him, memorizing details he feared forgetting. Camilla sat in her usual chair by the window, reading letters and handling correspondence with the dedication she had shown throughout their marriage. Harry called from California, his voice crackling through the phone connection. The conversation was brief but warm, years of family tensions temporarily set aside for what everyone knew might be their final talk. Charles wished his younger son was closer. Wished their relationship hadn't been damaged by so many misunderstandings and public revelations. As evening approached, Charles asked to be moved to his study. With help from William and the staff, he was settled into his favorite leather chair, surrounded by books and photographs that told the story of his life. Pictures of his mother, his father, his children, and Camilla filled every surface. "I want to record something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For posterity." William set up a small recording device while Camilla organized papers nearby. Charles began speaking slowly, his words chosen carefully despite his weakness. "I have been privileged to serve as heir to the throne for longer than anyone in our history. The crown has been both a blessing and a burden, shaping every decision I've made and every relationship I've cherished. I hope I have been worthy of the trust placed in me." His voice grew stronger as he continued, speaking about his love for Britain, his environmental concerns, his architectural passions, and his deep respect for all faiths and communities within the Commonwealth. But most importantly, he spoke about family. To William, You have shown wisdom beyond your years and compassion that will serve our people well. The crown passes to you not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make a difference in ways I could only dream of." Camilla stopped organizing papers and turned to listen, her face expressionless but her hands trembling slightly as she held a letter. "To Harry, my youngest son. I pray that distance and disagreements will not overshadow the love I have always felt for you. You have your mother's heart, and that will guide you well in whatever path you choose." Charles paused, looking directly at Camilla. "And to my dear wife, who stood by me through decades of criticism and controversy, who made my later years the happiest of my life, I can only hope that my love has been worthy of the sacrifices you made." Camilla's expression didn't change, but she turned back to her papers, continuing to sort through correspondence as if his words were simply background noise to her work. The recording session exhausted Charles, and he was helped back to bed as the sun set behind the trees he had planted years earlier. The house grew quiet except for the whispered conversations between staff members and the occasional ring of a telephone that Camilla answered with increasing irritation. That night, Charles lay awake thinking about legacy, not the constitutional legacy or the historical footnotes that would define his reign, but the personal legacy of relationships and love. He thought about Diana, about the mistakes that had haunted him for decades. He thought about his children and the wounds that remained unhealed. And he thought about Camilla, the woman sleeping beside him, who seemed to be slipping away even as he needed her most. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what Charles somehow knew would be among his final days. Outside, security guards maintained their vigil while photographers with long lenses waited in the darkness, ready to capture the moment when news would finally break. In the master bedroom of Highgrove House, a future king lay dying while his wife of 18 years slept peacefully beside him, already dreaming of a different future. The second day began before dawn, when Charles woke gasping for breath. Camilla stirred beside him, but didn't fully wake as he struggled to sit up. The oxygen tank that had been delivered the previous week stood ready beside the bed, but Charles hesitated to use it. Using the oxygen felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that his body was truly failing him. After several minutes, his breathing settled enough for him to lie back down. Through the window, he could see the first photographers already positioning themselves for the day, their equipment glinting in the early morning light. The media circus had intensified overnight as rumors spread about his condition. Camilla rose at 7, moving through her morning routine with mechanical precision. She dressed in a navy blue suit, applied her makeup with practiced efficiency, and checked her phone for messages from her staff. Charles watched her preparation with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Even in these circumstances, she maintained the dignity and composure expected of a royal consort. "The Archbishop wants to visit today," she said, not looking at him as she fastened her pearls. "I told him this afternoon would be suitable." Charles nodded weakly. He had been expecting this visit, knowing that protocol demanded certain conversations take place while he was still lucid enough to participate. The weight of constitutional responsibility never fully disappeared, even in death. Anne arrived mid-morning, her no-nonsense approach a stark contrast to the careful tiptoeing of other family members. She pulled up a chair directly beside Charles's bed and spoke to him as she always had, without the reverence or pity that had crept into other conversations. "The horses are doing well," she reported, "especially that mare you bought last spring. She's showing real promise for next season's competitions." Charles smiled genuinely for the first time in days. Anne had always understood that he needed normalcy, needed to be treated as her brother rather than as a dying king. They talked about farming, about the estate management issues that would need attention, about practical matters that somehow felt more important than grand gestures. "Camilla's holding up well," Anne observed, glancing toward the window where Camilla could be seen walking in the garden, speaking intensely into her phone. "She's stronger than people give her credit for." "She is," Charles agreed, "perhaps stronger than I realized." The afternoon brought a parade of visitors, each carrying the weight of unfinished business. The Prime Minister arrived with a folder of papers requiring royal assent, though everyone understood this was likely a formality. The conversation was brief but cordial, touching on matters of state that seemed suddenly distant and unimportant. Charles found himself studying faces more intently than ever before. He memorized the way the light fell across Camilla's cheek as she spoke with the Archbishop. He noticed how William's hands gestured exactly like his own when he was nervous. He observed the careful distance Catherine maintained, respectful but not intimate, the way one behaves around illness. The Archbishop's visit proved to be exactly what Charles had expected. They spoke about faith, about forgiveness, about the peace that comes with acceptance. Charles had never been a conventionally religious man, but he found comfort in the familiar rituals and prayers that had marked every significant moment of his life. "I have made mistakes," Charles admitted during their private conversation. "Mistakes that hurt people I loved." The Archbishop nodded with understanding. "We all carry regrets, Your Majesty, but we also carry the capacity for redemption and the promise of peace." After the Archbishop left, Charles asked to be alone with Camilla. The house grew quiet as staff withdrew, and family members found other rooms to occupy. For the first time in days, it was just the two of them, as it had been during their happiest moments together. "Do you remember our wedding day?" Charles asked, his voice barely audible. Camilla looked up from the correspondence she had been reviewing. "Of course I remember. You looked so beautiful, so happy. I thought we would have more time." Something shifted in Camilla's expression, a crack in the composure she had maintained for weeks. "We had 18 years, Charles. That's more than many people get. Is it enough?" The question hung in the air between them. Camilla set down her papers and moved closer to his bed, taking his hand in both of hers. For a moment, she looked like the woman who had loved him through decades of obstacles and criticism. "It has to be enough," she said finally, "because it's all we have." They sat in silence as the afternoon light faded. Charles found himself remembering their early days together, when they were young and the future seemed full of possibilities. They had been friends first, sharing a love of hunting and country life that had grown into something deeper and more complicated than either had anticipated. Their affair during his marriage to Diana had cost them both dearly. Years of public hatred, of being portrayed as the villains in a fairy tale romance, of watching their reputations destroyed in newspapers and television programs. But they had endured, finding their way back to each other when the world finally allowed it. "I know you've been making plans," Charles said suddenly. Camilla's hand stiffened in his. "What do you mean?" "For after. I've seen you on the phone, making arrangements. You don't have to pretend with me." She withdrew her hand and returned to her chair by the window. "Someone has to handle the practical matters, the funeral arrangements, the transition, the household staff. These things don't organize themselves." Charles understood. It was Camilla's way of coping, throwing herself into logistics and planning as a shield against grief. But there was something else in her manner, something that suggested she was already beginning to separate herself emotionally from what was happening. The evening brought another difficult phone call. This time from his nephew Harry, who was struggling to arrange travel from California. Security concerns and media attention were complicating his journey, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether he would arrive in time. "He's trying his best to get here," William reported after handling the logistics. "But the situation is complicated." Charles felt a deep sadness about Harry's absence. Their relationship had been strained for years, damaged by Harry's decision to step away from royal duties and his public criticisms of the family. But Charles had never stopped loving his younger son, never stopped hoping they might find their way back to each other. That night, as Camilla prepared for bed, Charles made a request that surprised her. "Sleep in the guest room tonight," he said gently. "I don't want to keep you awake with my restlessness." Camilla paused in her preparations. "I don't mind staying. I've been sleeping here for weeks." "I know, but tonight I need some time alone with my thoughts." She studied his face carefully, perhaps sensing that something had changed in his condition or his mindset. After a moment, she nodded and gathered her things. "Call me if you need anything," she said, kissing his forehead before leaving. Alone in the bedroom they had shared for years, Charles lay listening to the sounds of the old house settling for the night. He could hear Camilla moving around in the room down the hall, could hear the distant murmur of security guards maintaining their watch. He thought about the conversations he had not yet had, the words he had not yet spoken. There were apologies he wanted to make, forgiveness he wanted to seek, love he wanted to express before it was too late. But he was beginning to understand that some things would remain unfinished, some relationships would end with questions unanswered. The clock chimed 11, then midnight, then 1. Charles dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with images from his long life. He dreamed of his mother's coronation, of his own investiture as Prince of Wales, of his children as babies, of Camilla laughing in the gardens at Highgrove. When he woke near dawn, he knew instinctively that this would be his final day. The knowledge came not as fear, but as a strange kind of relief. The waiting was almost over. The final morning arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to settle over Highgrove House like a blanket. Even the birds in Charles's beloved gardens appeared subdued, their songs muted and hesitant. The staff moved through their duties with extra care, speaking in whispers as if loud voices might somehow accelerate what everyone could sense was approaching. Charles woke feeling strangely peaceful. The labored breathing that had plagued him for weeks seemed easier, though he understood this might be the false improvement that sometimes preceded the end. His mind felt clearer than it had in days, as if his body was gathering its remaining strength for these final hours. Camilla appeared in the doorway at 8 o'clock, already dressed and composed. She carried a breakfast tray, though they both knew he would eat little of it. Her movements were efficient and caring, but Charles noticed she avoided extended eye contact as she arranged his pillows and checked his medications. "Harry's plane landed an hour ago," she reported, her voice carefully neutral. "He should be here within the next 2 hours, depending on traffic and security arrangements." Charles felt a wave of relief wash over him. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the years of distance and disagreement, his younger son would make it in time. Some bridges could still be crossed, some words could still be spoken. William arrived with Catherine and the children shortly after 9. The grandchildren were quieter than usual, sensing the gravity of the situation even if they didn't fully understand it. 7-year-old George approached the bed hesitantly, his small hand reaching out to touch his grandfather's. "Grandpa Charles, are you feeling better today?" he asked with the directness that only children possess. Charles smiled, finding strength he didn't know he still had. "I'm feeling peaceful, George. That's sometimes even better than feeling well." The boy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. Charlotte climbed carefully onto the bed, snuggling against Charles's side with the fearless affection of a 4-year-old. For several minutes, the room was filled with the simple pleasure of a grandfather enjoying his grandchildren, the weight of crown and duty temporarily forgotten. Catherine gently gathered the children after a while, understanding that Charles needed to conserve his energy for other conversations. As they prepared to leave, George turned back from the doorway. Will you still watch over us when you're in heaven, Grandpa? The question hit Charles with unexpected force. Always, he managed to say. I'll always be watching over you. After they left, Charles asked William to sit with him privately. Father and son had grown closer in recent years, as William had taken on more royal duties and proven his readiness for the responsibilities ahead. Now they needed to have the conversation that would officially pass the torch. You're going to be a better king than I would have been, Charles said, his voice growing weaker but his words clear. You understand the modern world in ways I never could. You'll know how to connect with people I could never reach. William shook his head. I learned everything I know about service and duty from watching you. You've prepared me for this my entire life. Your mother prepared you too, Charles added softly. Diana gave you something I struggled to give you. She taught you how to show emotion, how to connect with people's hearts. Don't lose that. They talked about practical matters, about the constitutional requirements that would need to be addressed, about the kind of reign William envisioned. But underneath the official business was a deeper conversation between a father and son who had learned to respect and love each other despite the unusual circumstances of their lives. Harry arrived at noon, looking exhausted from his journey but relieved to have made it in time. The reunion between the brothers was awkward at first, years of tension not easily set aside. But Charles watched with satisfaction as they gradually relaxed with each other, united by their shared love for him despite their personal differences. I'm glad you came, Charles told Harry during their private conversation. I was afraid our last words would be angry ones. Harry's composure cracked slightly. I never wanted that, Dad. I just needed to find my own path. I know, and I'm proud of the man you've become, even if I don't always understand your choices. They spoke about Harry's life in California, about his children who were too young to travel, about his hopes for a future relationship with the family he had left behind. Charles offered what wisdom he could about balancing personal happiness with family obligations, though he acknowledged his own record was far from perfect. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors. Anne returned with Edward and Sophie, creating a gathering of siblings that reminded Charles of their childhood together. They shared memories and inside jokes, treating him with the casual affection of brothers and sister rather than the formal deference due a dying monarch. Camilla orchestrated everything with quiet efficiency, managing schedules and ensuring Charles wasn't overwhelmed while still allowing him to see everyone who mattered to him. But Charles noticed she remained emotionally distant, participating in conversations without truly engaging, present in body, but already withdrawing in spirit. As evening approached, Charles began to feel his strength ebbing away more rapidly. His breathing became more labored, and the oxygen tank was finally brought into regular use. Dr. Matthews arrived and spoke quietly with the family, confirming what everyone could see. It's time to say goodbye, Charles told his children and grandchildren. I want you to know how proud I am of all of you, how much joy you've brought to my life. The goodbyes were heartbreaking and beautiful. William promised to honor his father's memory through his service to the crown. Harry pledged to bring his children to visit their grandfather's grave. The grandchildren gave him drawings they had made, pictures of flowers and horses and castles that would go with him into whatever came next. As the family members gradually withdrew to give him peace, Charles found himself alone with Camilla for what would be their final conversation as husband and wife. Sit with me, he requested, patting the bed beside him. Camilla hesitated for a moment before complying, settling carefully next to him as she had done thousands of times during their marriage. I need you to know, Charles began, his voice now barely a whisper, that loving you was the best decision I ever made, not the easiest, not the most popular, but the best. Camilla's face remained composed, her hands folded in her lap. We had a good run, Charles. Despite everything, we had happiness. Will you miss me? The question was vulnerable, almost childlike. For the first time in weeks, Camilla's facade cracked slightly. "Of course I'll miss you, but I've been preparing for this for months. I've had to. For my own sanity." Charles understood. She had been protecting herself, building emotional walls to survive the grief that was coming. It was practical, perhaps even necessary, but it left him feeling isolated in these final moments. As the sun set behind the trees, Charles felt the last of his strength leaving him. His breathing became more irregular, his consciousness beginning to fade in and out. The family was called back to the bedroom, gathering around his bed in a circle of love and grief. "Thank you," Charles whispered, his eyes moving from face to face. "For everything. For forgiving me. For loving me despite my failures." His gaze finally settled on Camilla, sitting in her chair by the window, her face a mask of controlled composure. He tried to speak to her specifically, to offer one last expression of love and gratitude, but the words wouldn't come. "Camilla," he managed to murmur, his voice barely audible. She looked at him then, their eyes meeting across the room that had been their shared sanctuary for so many years. For a moment, her composure wavered, and he saw a glimpse of the woman who had loved him through everything. But as his breathing grew more labored and his voice grew weaker, Camilla turned away. She walked to the window, her back to the bed, her shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining control. When Charles murmured her name one final time, she didn't turn around. "Goodbye, my love," Charles whispered into the gathering darkness. William held one of his father's hands while Harry held the other. Anne stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaming down her face. Edward and Sophie flanked the bed, their own grief evident in their faces. But Camilla remained at the window, looking out at the gardens Charles had loved so much, her tears falling silently where no one could see them. She had loved him completely, but she couldn't watch him die. The woman who had stood by him through public scandals and private struggles, who had endured years of hatred to be with him, found herself unable to witness his final moment. Charles's breathing grew slower, more peaceful. His eyes closed as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, casting the room in gentle twilight. At 8:47 in the evening, with his family surrounding him in love, King Charles passed quietly into whatever comes after this life. The silence that followed was profound and sacred. William, now king, knelt beside his father's bed and kissed his forehead in a final gesture of love and respect. Harry wept openly, years of complicated emotions flowing freely. Anne reached across to close her brother's eyes with gentle fingers. And Camilla remained at the window, her back turned to the scene, her tears falling onto the windowsill as she gazed out at the darkness that had settled over the estate. She had loved him completely, but in the end, she could not bear to watch love die. Outside, the photographers were already receiving word that the vigil was over. Soon the world would know that an era had ended, that the crown had passed to a new generation. But inside Highgrove House, a family mourned not just a king, but a father, brother, and husband who had lived and loved and made his peace with an imperfect world.